It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, you bet. It's fun to talk to people about this stuff.
I guess to start, I'd like to have you just introduce yourself. I read that you're from Nebraska. I'm a fellow Midwest kid myself from Missouri. So
All right.
just who are you? What are you best known for? And how did you get into music?
Okay, those are some good questions. Well, I'm John von Seggern. I am a musician and technologist. I am best known for having worked with the electronic musician John Hassell from 2014 to 2020. I co-produced 2 albums of his and performed with him in Europe and so on. And I also currently work in music education. I am the director of educational technology for a electronic music school in Burbank, California called Icon Collective. And I administer a program where students learn how to produce music and using computer tools. And at the moment, I'm most engaged in implementing AI solutions to help my students. That's where my biggest focus is at work.
Interesting. And with the online school, I'm curious to get your take on this because I think there's a big rise in that type of industry. But in your experience, how have you seen that sort of business model work the best? Online education.
That's a good question because I've been working in online education since 2011 at various institutions. And during the pandemic, obviously, there was a huge upsurge in online education, but the quality of the online education we all experienced was quite variable, let's say. And so personally, my school is it's a music production school, but it's really an art school. And the in-person on-campus school has always been built around personal mentorship with a working professional in the industry. And so in creating and improving always the online programs, I've always tried to emphasize the human connections. And I was one of the first schools to switch to Zoom as soon as that became available. And that was a big step up because just the quality of the connection made it more intimate, the conversations you would have. And so my school has a lot of group live sessions and one-on-one sessions. And we do have, of course, we have courses and the students watch videos and they submit assignments like you would do in any online system, but we really try to emphasize the human connection and not just have it be, doing some things on a screen. I think that can be very alienating if that's the main part of your education. So that's kind of my take on online education.
What would some of those assignments be, just out of curiosity, in a music school like that?
Well, in our school, we're trying to teach you to master all the basic skills you need to be a modern musician, which includes some music theory, some keyboard playing, the tools of computer production, also knowing something about the music business and how to present yourself and brand yourself. You kind of have to know, if you're a creator of anything these days, you kind of have to know how to do all those things,
Mm-hmm.
And so we're teaching musicians how to do it. Basically, that's our focus. And so to answer your question, for the assignments, they have to master various skills to be able to produce music. So most of the assignments are some kind of challenge. Like, for example, synthesis is part of the curriculum. Some of the assignments, they have to recreate a certain type of sound to the best of their ability. And then a teacher will tell them how close they came or what maybe they should have done to do it better.
Nice. With the computers used to make music now, is there a particular DAW that you've aligned yourself with?
Yeah, our school primarily uses Ableton, and I have actually been using Ableton since version 1.0.
Wow.
Proud to say, I produced my first Ableton course for Ableton 4, which was we were on CD-ROMs at that point. And then I wrote a book about Ableton 6. I used to write a column about Ableton for a British magazine for back around that same time. And so yeah, I'm an Ableton fan, but I wouldn't mind using one of the other ones. Mostly you want to just, with any of these computer tools, you want to get to the point where you know it well enough that it becomes your instrument and you don't have to think about it too much. I'm less interested in knowing all the latest features than just kind of being able to translate what I'm trying to do as fast as possible without getting hung up on the little minutia.
Are you teaching your students about AI?
We've started. So I have one teacher who's really into AI also, and we talk a lot about it. And so we're designing a course. Well, right now he is doing a weekly session about AI for the students. He's been doing that for about 6 months. I was doing it with him for a while, but now he's taken it over. And we're making this course. The challenge of the course, actually, we'll finish the course quite soon and roll it out. We're going to make it like a bonus course for the students because the real challenge is the technology is changing so fast. We can't really make a curriculum where you learn specific tools. It's more going to be like types of things you can do with AI, and we'll just change the contents as we need to, as things change.
Have you fooled around at all with some of those tools that are starting to come out? Like there's Suno and Udio, I believe is how it's pronounced.
You know, I have been fooling around with them for a long time, since long before those models came out. I was trying, last year I was trying all the things I could get my hands on. I've kind of gotten bored of it at the moment, I have to say, because I also have explored AI art and AI video quite extensively, and I definitely appreciate what it gives me, especially as a visual artist. I am not a visual artist, but I do have a pretty particular vision of what I like. In fact, I made this image behind me.
Oh,
And
nice.
so I do appreciate what AI can bring, but I also have found the process of typing into boxes and waiting for things to happen is not that fun, I've found. And so I've kind of got bored of it at the moment. I don't really want to do with it. In fact, it's led me back to just practicing my instruments for hours every day instead at the moment. So that's an interesting reaction. I'll have to see how that goes. But I kind of have a dual perspective on it because I do use the art engines, but the music ones I've kind of lost interest in. So,
do you know how those types of things are trained? Like, for example, Suno, how did they make that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, in the big picture, it works similarly to the art engines, I believe, but they are purposely vague about the details because particularly, I mean, there's been all kinds of copyright issues with the art and text engines, obviously. With the music engines, I mean, nobody knows what they trained it on.
Yeah.
But it's tricky to think, like, most of the good music in the world is copyrighted, right? It's not public domain. So if you wanted to make the best music engine, you'd have to use copyrighted music to make it, presumably. And that's the tricky bit with music, is that the music companies are more likely to sue and have a lot of money and a long history of filing lawsuits, whereas authors and writers are a giant dispersed mass of individuals with less bargaining power. You get what I mean? But I do find it likely that in the big picture, I think these tools in general have too many benefits that we're not, as a society, we're not going to decide that because of copyright law, we should forbid people to use GPT-4 or something like this. I don't think that really makes sense, to be honest. But for the music one, I could see some outcome where these model companies are paying the big labels or something, some kind of fees, or maybe they work out something with Spotify. They're probably negotiating it now. I'm sure in fact, I'm sure they are. But as with a lot of things in technology, it's much better for them. And by them, I mean the technology folks, to make the first move and bring this out rather than try to work out all the legal details in advance. I mean, to be honest, that probably wouldn't be possible. Like, we probably wouldn't have GPT-4 if they had tried to negotiate all the things. It's just like if you're a small-time music producer and you want to use a sample by some huge artist, they're never going to say yes, right? But if you make a great song, then you might be able to work it out with them on the back end, you know? So that's kind of how I look at it. But I expect it to be a very controversial topic for years to come. But in the big picture, I don't think technology goes backwards. So I think we're going to have these for better or for worse. So we better try to turn them to our advantage. That's kind of how I'm looking at it.
Is that something that you would care about? Like, if you found out, for example, one of these models was trained on some of your guitar melodies, and there's the artists out there that, like, they won't let you sample any of their stuff regardless, no matter what. Are you somebody who's in favor of that, or are you more like, that's my art, no AI on it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. I think that's from what I've observed, that's very personal, and people tend to have very personal reactions to it. Personally, I don't really care, because I kind of look at it like this. I think the text models are a good way to think of it. Like, GPT-4 is an amalgamation of like all the human knowledge that's ever existed, all put together. So what is the value of any one person's contribution out of that? You know, even Albert Einstein, like, how much of a percentage of the total sum of human knowledge did Albert Einstein create? A tiny percentage, right? So I don't see that some kind of system where artists or writers would get paid some mythical fee out of a system. That doesn't seem like it makes sense to me. And I think that was actually something that was tried in some forms in the earlier internet. Like, micropayments was a concept like decades ago that people thought would be really cool. Every time you read something, you would pay a penny. But I think it failed mostly because of technical issues, honestly. It costs too much to run a system that's just paying people out in fractions of a cent all the time. It costs more to run the system than you would end up paying people. So,
right.
And also, it'd be wildly impractical. You could be using half the processing power of the internet just to keep track of these micropayments, you know? So anyway, yeah, personally, I don't really care about that. But I know there's plenty of people that are bound and determined that it shouldn't be trained. I don't really understand that, to be honest, but I know that a lot of people feel that way, for sure.
You brought up GPT-4 a couple times. I've been seeing a lot of speculation online that we're going to get GPT 4.5 or GPT-5 here pretty soon. If you had to pull it out of your hat, what's your prediction for what that kind of looks like? I know that's a really tough question, but I'm just curious to hear what you'd think.
Well, you know, I mean, they're not the only game in town at this point. I just mentioned them because everybody knows them, and they're the best example to use of the kind of state of the art. But there's also Claude and Llama and Mixtral, and all of those are very good. I use Claude actually most of the time. It's a little smarter than GPT-4 at the moment.
Yeah, me too.
But the latest news in the AI realm, I don't know if you've been reading, there is this thing called Chatbot Arena. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I've been keeping up with that. It's very interesting.
Up with that. Yeah, so there are those secret GPT-2 models that are testing, and I did see that Sam Altman tweeted something about GPT-2, so it seems pretty certain that those are their models. But from what I read, I don't know if that's smart enough to be GPT-5. I think there's a lot of pressure on them to make a whole generational leap when they call something GPT-5. So their next thing might not be GPT-5. But I don't know. I do feel like they're a little bit behind. I don't use GPT-4 that much anymore, to be honest, because the other one's a little better.
Yeah, I found Claude Opus to be better than GPT-4. And my career outside of doing this is a lot of legal writing, legal blogging for attorneys' websites and whatnot. And if you want to blog, Claude is far superior. Just I've noticed ChatGPT, it has these kind of patterns that it uses, like certain phrases that are just a dead giveaway that this was written by AI. And it's not really a way that any human writes. So I think Claude is a little bit smarter in that way for sure.
That actually brings up an interesting topic, which is that these different tools and engines do have their different characters and personalities, you could say. But like with the different art engines, they do have very different models and very different styles that they'll produce. And they also get updated all the time. I went to, what was that, maybe 3 or 4 months ago? There's an organization here in LA called AI LA, and they've been having events on kind of around different topics and different types of speakers, just because things are moving so fast and they just want to kind of stimulate discussion. So I went to one that was all artists, and there was this one woman who is a digital artist that uses a lot of AI, and she was talking about how a lot of art, I mean, this is how I would look at it too. A lot of artists find the most interesting results by trying to find the ways that the tools don't quite do what they're supposed to do. You try to kind of break them and work around the edges. And so that's what she does a lot. But the models get changed a lot. So she might find something one day that makes very interesting images, and then she'll make a lot of them because tomorrow it might be updated and they might not work anymore, you know? So these things are kind of transient in a way too, in a weird way.
As far as this stuff goes with music, could you see a world essentially where maybe you train an AI model on your voice and then you just like type the lyrics or something, and you can already get a really good instrumental from Suno? And then this kind of gap where artists are releasing one album a year, it turns into like an album a week, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that could happen. When you get into the weeds of it, it's a little more complicated than that because, I mean, for example, I have a band with a female singer in Honduras, and she is also a voiceover artist for commercial voiceover work. And she has played around with AI voice models herself to try to do some of her work so she could do more work. But for voice, we were talking about this one day, for voiceover work, and this is analogous to music, I think, for voiceover work, like she said, what people pay her for is they want to do a session with her where she says the things and then they kind of coach her, or they tell her how they imagine it or how they want it to be or whatever. That's why they're paying her. They're not paying her to just have like a regular thing that anybody can do, you know? And so she said it took longer for her to like put it in the computer and try to make it so like the accent of the words would come out like they wanted, and so much easier just to say it herself. If you do singing with the singing models, what you can do is you do sing it yourself instead of typing it, but then you can have it sound like somebody else sang it, not you. That's kind of the technique. But that way you can kind of guide it with your voice. So like I could sing a song and make it sound like she sang it if I wanted to. I was thinking of doing that recently. but and I'm not really interested in doing that, to be honest. I want her input. That's why I'm working with her. So I don't know. To me, it would be pointless to do that. I'm not interested in having my version of her. It's kind of an interesting idea, but that's not why I'm working with her. So,
right. Part of the reason I ask is I don't know how closely you follow mainstream music, but there's a track that Drake released where he used an AI model of Tupac, and to me that is awesome and super creative. And now it's like these artists can never truly die if these models like 11 Labs continue to get better, like all this other stuff is getting better. And who's to say we don't end up with a Tupac album that's better than what Tupac put out when he was alive? You know, I just think it's very cool.
Did you read about the Randy Travis thing that just came out?
No, what's that?
Well, Randy Travis just released a new song, but Randy Travis had a stroke before, like years before. So he can't actually sing anymore. So he made a song with like a model of his own voice from years before, basically. That's what it is. And when it was released, I saw somebody post, before they even said that, somebody post like, wait a minute, Randy Travis had a stroke. How can he sing? That must be an AI model of him. And then I saw they actually said the story that's actually true. But I guess, I mean, to get back to your question about that, though, I mean, I do see, I mean, people are going to use these technologies to make songs that people are going to like and buy. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, I think there will be a lot of unpredictable effects from the technology. I try to look at how the art is playing out because the art things came out a little bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still early days, honestly. But one thing I keep thinking about is that whatever is easy to do, then anybody can do it, and then it doesn't really mean anything anybody, or nobody cares about that. So if it becomes like you can just type in a box, like make me a dance pop track that's 5 minutes long, it's going to take more than that to get people's attention then, you know what I mean? And I'm not sure what that's going to be, although I do have some ideas. I mean, I think your artist identity is going to become more and more important, and doing things live and in person and authentically is going to become more important, because that, I mean, we've already seen those trends for years, honestly, but I think it could get a lot more because there's going to be so much fake everything everywhere, and the people are just going to be craving reality, I feel like. So it's kind of led me back to practicing my instruments all the time, actually, and I just started having jam sessions with real musicians again. Instead of doing computer music all the time. So, but at this point, nobody knows. Like, but I think the effects will be possibly surprising, not what everyone thinks. We'll see what happens.
What does that look like for you? Obviously, you are a professional musician at a very high level, but I'm curious as far as what it took for you to become a master like that, and even in your day-to-day life, practicing, like, keeping your skills sharp. What does that look like for you?
I mean, if you want to be an instrumentalist at a very high level, you have to practice for thousands of hours. There's kind of no way around it. And you have to continually practice for hours. I practice for an hour to a day at least now. But lately I've been practicing more, actually, a lot more, because I'm trying to get better. As long as you feel like you're getting better, then it's worth the investment. If you're an instrumentalist for a really long time, your skills will go in cycles, and you'll hit plateaus at different points. And sometimes you got to take a step back, and somehow it's percolating in your subconscious or something, I think. And then you can come back to it and make more progress. That's kind of how I think about it.
And I kind of want to pivot a little bit into your career as a touring musician, but
Sure.
You mentioned a lot about branding and authenticity. Just from your experience touring around with musicians who have made it at a high level, what have you seen work best as far as monetization and gaining a following, things of that nature? Because it seems like music is one of the harder things to monetize.
That's for sure. I mean, my career has been very strange and unique, and I've possibly not a good example for other people, but I do run a school where we're training young musicians to become professionals, and I talk to them every day, and I understand their struggles. And at this point, like, music itself, you don't make money from selling music online, unless you're Taylor Swift, I suppose. But you have to be, you have to be having millions and millions of streams to make any kind of money. And people do make money from sync licensing, like for films and things of that nature, advertising. If your song is known, then it has some value that somebody might license it in something. Touring, it seems like people are not making that much money from touring anymore. To be honest, people make most of their money from merch. That's how people make money. Yeah, that's pretty much how people make money. You could see that your whole existence as a musician is like, as a front end for a t-shirt sewing operation. Basically, it's sad to say, but it is what it is. I mean, I'm not one to complain about how things are, though, I have to say, because I don't know. I like to think about economics. You have to think about supply and demand and the bigger picture of economics. So like when I was a young man and we bought vinyl records, it was really hard to make vinyl records because it was really hard to record a record in the first place. If you were a band, you had to raise money to do it. So you either had to raise tens of thousands of dollars yourself, which most bands couldn't possibly do because they didn't have that money, or you had to get a record contract with somebody, which most people never did. So only very few percentage of artists back then, of bands, would make records. And so there weren't as many. And then you had to spend, $10, $15, $20 to buy one. So you're only, as a consumer, you were only going to buy a few. You were going to be really careful about what you bought. And that's why there was so many magazines and reviews and stuff, because you had to decide how to spend your money. And then if you did spend that money, the band would get some of it. Usually not very much of it. But some bands who got through that system and became big made a lot of money, no doubt. Like Led Zeppelin, let's say, the big bands until the 90s, there were still big bands that made a lot of money that way. Then when the internet started, it flipped. And then the thing to understand also is that is when computer music production really started. And so it wasn't only that you could put music on the internet, it became a lot easier to record music. And that happened at about the same time. It was around 2000, So then what happened was way more people started recording albums. Of course, most of them weren't any good, but some of them were, and more of them, a lot more of them out there were good than in the old days, because there were just way more of them. There were many people who were talented artists who then were able to record albums who in the old days you just never would have heard of them, through no fault of their own. Maybe they just weren't organized enough or whatever, or rich enough. So because of all that, now there's just so much music. There's thousands of new songs every day. I actually have 2 new songs today, in fact. But in that kind of environment, all these people complaining that Spotify doesn't pay them. Okay, but if music if it was still like the old days, most of these artists wouldn't be making albums at all. And people wouldn't be buying their albums at all either, because when albums cost $20, you're only going to mostly buy albums by people or famous people, or people that had a lot of reviews. So some indie artists that you never heard of, well, you're not going to buy them, right? So I just see the whole situation in a much kind of bigger context than a lot of people these days. I don't see how the only way that you could get more money from streaming is if Congress said that every music stream needs to pay a certain minimum amount of money. And that might be a good idea, honestly. In fact, there is some legislation pending that would do exactly that. I probably won't pass, I doubt. But you can't just blame the companies, I think, because that's just kind of the economics of the situation as it's evolved. So anyway, we're selling t-shirts now. That's how it works.
Well,
but I mean, to say it in a better way, if you make great enough art that you attract a following of people who are passionate about what you have to say, then they will buy things from you.
Sure.
And you will get money from it. And you have to figure out what to sell to them. It's not music. People do make some money from selling music products. It depends on the genre, actually. Some fans of some genres are more willing to buy physical copies of things. I don't know, not so much in electronic music, I feel like. But
well, it seems like you might have gotten in the early days, like you mentioned, pre-2000, pre-internet, and we're touring the world at that time. So I can't imagine how big some of those artists overseas and even worldwide had to have been to really gain a following before the internet was even a thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had a very strange career, as I said. So in the mid-late 90s, I lived in Hong Kong. and I played with Chinese pop stars, and I played with the biggest Chinese pop stars, literally. So I played with the two biggest. So I mean, it was before the internet, but those guys were on every media channel 24 hours a day. So that's how they're following. Actually, one of them, Andy Lau, was a movie star who became a singer. And he was a very good actor and an okay singer. The other one, Jackie Chung, was a quite famous singer. He's probably the most famous artist ever from Hong Kong, actually. Jackie Chung Hokiao. And when I got the gig with him, I lived in Japan, and I didn't know any of them or who he was or anything about that. It's a complicated story how I got that call, but they asked me to go play with them for a year, and I was like, what is this even? Is this a scam? So I went to Tower Records in Tokyo, and they had a big international music section. And I was like, who is this guy? And I went there, and he had like 50 albums. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. He's got 50 albums, then I guess he's a real guy.
How did you get overseas in the first place, and how does that call happen? You said it's a complicated story. You don't have to get into all the details if you don't want to, but it's just interesting to talk to world travelers.
Sure. Well, we got to dial back to when that was happening. So I went to jazz school in New York City in 1991. And back then, that was kind of at the peak of the Japan is the rich upcoming country days. It's actually a little bit after the peak, actually. But we still got then in New York, we got a lot of Japanese people would come visit the city, and they loved jazz and music, and they would come to the jazz clubs all the time. So we were always going to these jazz clubs, and there were always half full of Japanese people. And I also had probably 8 or 10 Japanese friends in school at the jazz school who were musicians. And so among my American friends and we kind of got the idea, like, maybe it'd be a good idea to live in Japan. They seem to like music a lot, there must be a lot of opportunities there. And so to make a long story short, I had a girlfriend who became an interpreter. She actually was not Japanese, but she was very good at languages. And so she learned Japanese and became an interpreter. I ended up moving to Japan and marrying her so I could stay there. And then I worked as a musician in Japan for several years. But I was mostly playing jazz then. So I played in a lot of Japanese jazz clubs. And then at a certain point, I was playing like almost every night. And every night I would make like the equivalent of like $100. And so I was very young then, but at some point I realized, like, you can only save so much money if you're only making $100 a day. So I was like, I gotta get some bigger gigs or something. And then while I was thinking that, I had got to know, this is how you get gigs as a musician. You just get to know more and more people, and they know who you are and what you can do. And then one day they need you for something and somebody calls you. So in this case, it was this Chinese production company, this Chinese band leader who said, we don't have very many good studio level musicians in Hong Kong. We need a new person. And he was trying to find a Japanese person, actually, because he figured it'd be easier for a Japanese person to fit into their whole kind of scene. And there are a lot of good musicians in Japan, but just because of kind of random chance, he got somebody in my network who then called me. And so then I went over there, and then it turned out to be this huge gig. So then I moved there for about 5 years. And then I did that for about 5 years. I played with all these pop stars, and I did studio recordings for them, played on a bunch of records for them. And then I went on like 5 world tours. And then at that point, that was a turning point in my career, because I just kind of realized I didn't really become a musician because I wanted to play Chinese pop music. That wasn't really my goal. And so I really wanted to travel. That was one of my goals. And so we traveled for 5 years pretty much nonstop. So after that, it was like, okay, enough. Enough is enough with the traveling. I need to do something more meaningful, something more substantial, So since then, I've done a lot of different things, but I didn't want to just go on and be a session bass player. It just wasn't that fun after a while.
Hmm. Did you find in your time living there, one, I've heard a lot of things about Japanese food, that it's very good. So I'm curious, is that actually the case? And two, any cultural norms or differences, Western versus Eastern world, that you can speak on?
Sure, Japanese food is very good. Although when I lived in Japan, I was a jazz musician, so I didn't have a lot of money, and Japan is also very expensive. So I didn't eat out all that much, to be honest. Although when I had gigs, I would get really good food. Yeah, so that is true. But as far as fitting in with the culture, yeah, I mean, Japan in particular is, I would say, one of the more difficult countries to fit in as a foreigner. If you're a visitor there, they're extremely nice to visitors in general. It's probably one of the best countries to visit as a visitor. But it's an island. It has their psychology is affected by having been an island for their entire history. So they didn't have like people from different countries passing through all the time, So that's just how their culture is. So that was difficult for me at first, but I would say, actually, as a Midwesterner, I found my Midwestern culture was actually very helpful in fitting in over there because I was always raised to care about if I was irritating other people and to take them into account and not bug other people. That was always a value I was taught, which I still have. You shouldn't be annoying the crap out of everybody around you all the time. You should be considerate. And so if you just take that as a value, you just think like, okay, these people don't do things like I'm used to, but I should be considerate of how they do things because I am a guest here, and this is their culture I'm trying to fit in with. So that's only logical to me. I don't understand people that don't see it that way. But I would say also, though, beyond that, there's also a level for Westerners in Asia, which is that there was a long history of colonialism and of white people taking themselves to be superior over Asians. And so it's not like that now, but I found that many of the Asian people that I knew might have encountered that attitude before and were a little suspect of me. And so I always had the attitude like, I'm going to show you I'm not like that. I'm not one of those people. Like, I'm just a person, and I'm going to insist that you treat me just like another person. And that proved to be very successful, and I was always able to fit in with people over there. Although the first year was more difficult, but when I moved to Hong Kong, their culture is very different than Japan. Hong Kong was an open trading port for its whole history, and so it's much more international. And it's also there. I kind of liken Hong Kong to New York. It's kind of more loud and aggressive and competitive, like that. But still, I mean, the same thing applies. Like, if you're just considerate of how other people take things, that goes a long way.
It's funny you bring that up. I always make the point that I think being from the Midwest is its own form of a superpower because, like you said, it kind of gives you a little bit of relatability and humility to people from everywhere.
I would agree with that. Yep.
Yeah, it's not super glamorous. Like, I understand you're a Nebraska born and raised. I'm Missouri. So it's like there's not a ton of super fancy industry. There's not that much to do, not as many huge cities. So you kind of got to get by being polite and friendly to everybody.
Yeah, for whatever reason, it definitely is a cultural value. And I mean, you know what? The Japanese share that value. The Japanese care about being nice to people also. So not every culture values it as much as we do, I'd say.
And speaking of other cultures, I guess to go even further back in the timeline, I read that you spent a semester in India.
I
And
did.
I'm curious what that was like, and if you came across any Buddhist or Hindu philosophies, things like that, that kind of stuck with you over time.
Yeah, I mean, I went on a study abroad program for a semester in India to study Buddhism specifically. That was the topic. So I studied Buddhist philosophy and meditation and Hindi language and also some music, actually.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it definitely stuck with me until now, I would say. I mean, there's several, I wouldn't say that I'm a Buddhist, but there's several points about it that have always stuck with me. Like, for example, the idea of impermanence, that everything is changing. And so you shouldn't base your happiness around something that could prove to not exist tomorrow. So that kind of, I would say the kind of fundamental frame of thinking of Buddhism is something that's stuck with me ever since then.
Nice. And then from there, as I understand it in your timeline, you wrote a thesis paper, which I thought sounded very interesting. What was that about?
Which one are you referring to?
I have in my notes here that you focused on how the digitization and etherealization of music through computer networks.
I did. So I just was saying that in about 2000, the year 2000, I kind of came to the end of the road with being a session bass player because it was just driving me crazy because I was just so bored with what we were doing. So I wasn't quite sure what to do then. And I was in Hong Kong. And as fate would have it, I met a girl who was a Chinese graduate student at Hong Kong University. And come to find out, she got a pretty good stipend from the university for being a graduate student. And then I thought, I'd like to be smarter, study more. So, and I don't really know what to do right now. So I ended up going to Hong Kong University actually as a graduate student. And I was in the music department, but I was studying ethnomusicology, the anthropology of music. And at first, my study topic was around dance music. And then I kind of moved into internet music because I was more interested in that. And eventually I decided to move back to the States, and I found a professor at University of California, Riverside, who was working in that area. And I ended up finishing my studies there. And that's where I wrote that thesis that you're talking about. And that thesis is very relevant to what's happening now, because my thesis was about how it was the immediate post-Napster era when music was first being traded online, and it was changing to online files instead of CDs and tapes. And the changes that I was talking about earlier, like, were all happening. Like, you could produce music on a computer and you could distribute it to the internet all from a computer. So it's just a lot easier. And also you could this is the kind of stuff I studied. So if you're making music like that, it's a lot easier to combine things, because you can just grab a sample of, like, you want to use Indian music, just get a sample of some Indian music. You know, before that, if you wanted to use Indian music, you had to find an Indian musician. And depending on where you are, that might not be easy, right? So, and the same thing for anything, any musical element you could imagine, you'd have to find somebody that was good at doing that if you wanted it in your music. But now you could just splice them all together. So I thought at the time, like, that's going to lead to people combining things and making new styles of music that we don't have now, which it has. But that's what I was studying. So now I'm thinking about that in terms of AI and what that's going to lead to. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure. My intuition is that it's going to lead people to value things that weren't made with AI, actually. But
I think so too. It's even like human writing, I think will be more valuable, human thoughts and words. And even further than that, like athletes, if you're a good boxer, if you can actually do something in the physical realm, I think that will be extremely valuable going forward. Because
stand-up comedy.
Because it seems like we're headed towards the Matrix, literally, like either a chip in your brain or we're all somehow merging with this technology. And I think we'll lose a certain subsect of the population to just total zombie mode with this stuff. Like, you think social media is addictive, scrolling on your phone, like just give it 15 years. But I think there will be some people that kind of resist it and stay 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And the people who can build houses and do your plumbing and all that stuff are going to just continue to be very valuable.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I do think it's really hard to predict. So, like with the AI music, like there's pop music. I mean, there's a lot of pop music where people don't really care how it was made, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you told them that the new, I don't want to pick on anybody, but let's just say one of the biggest pop singers today, if you told them that her new song was made with an AI version of her voice, like that would, most people might not care about that. But then again, there's other kinds of music, like more niche music, where if you told people that it was made with AI, they would hate you forever and never listen to you again, you know? And we'll see how that plays out.
I think it'll be interesting to hear how this stuff plays out as far as in your eardrums. How does it actually sound? Because you go listen to a song from the 60s and the way that it's recorded, it sounds different than the mainstream stuff you hear now, which is recorded on different types of technology. So I wonder with AI going forward, what that's going to sound like.
I mean, it's true what you say, but there's a huge industry of things that emulate the sound of how things used to sound.
Yes.
And I did some really weird things with AI. Before Suno and Udio, there's another open source engine called, it's not open source actually, but it's called Stable Audio. It's made by the same Stability AI that made Stable Diffusion. And that was the most advanced one before Suno came out. And you could make anything with that one because they're not trying to make well, let's just say they're less concerned about copyright than even the other ones are. So you can literally, I think they just threw everything at that. But I was trying to make like drum tracks with it. And just as an experiment one day, I started to see if I could make like jazz drum tracks that sound like they're played by somebody. And it kept like giving me like the whole recording because presumably that's what's turned on. So then I started telling it, I was trying to isolate the drums and stuff. And finally I was getting these things that it sounded like what it would sound like if you were in the booth with the drummer. So you hear the drums, but you hear like tiny bit of the piano, like it's in the next room or the next booth. It's so crazy. I was like, wow, this is it's not actually the moment of being there when he was playing them, which that kind of freaked me out actually. That was weird. But I think that simulating live things is also going to become so good that it's going to become a challenge to prove that you're actually a real person or live. It already is becoming a challenge, honestly. But then it'll be like, presumably, if you make a YouTube video every day talking to the camera, probably really you. Because it would be just easier to do that way. I don't know. It's going to get weird. I can't predict all the things that are going to happen either. I've seen some really strange things too.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience with Suno as what you're talking about, where I was asking it to make a particular type of instrumental. And at the very beginning, it sounded like it was somebody's muffled hip hop beat tag. Like, have you heard things like that? Like,
yeah, I get what you mean.
It was like, that is super
quite hear
weird.
what it said.
Yeah, but it was definitely there. It's like, Okay,
Yeah,
so
because it
it
just
must
is
have gotten that
simulating
from
that.
somebody.
I will tell you another important thing I think that I've been thinking about a lot is just that I think the process of making art is what determines the content ultimately. And my process, since I started working with AI music, I've much more gone back to where my process is just picking up my instrument and playing it because it's the most fun and meaningful for me. And I get the most feeling out of it. Sitting and typing into boxes just isn't that fun, honestly. And I realized I've made a lot of AI imagery for my band, actually. And last year I was really into it. I was doing it a lot, but I kind of slowed down after a while. And I realized it's because it's kind of a mentally exhausting process. Like I sit for a few hours, and because it takes so long, especially when you're doing video, it takes a long time to render. So I usually end up with like multiple windows open, and I'm like typing into one and hitting it and doing 10 of these, you know, and you're just like going, and after a few hours, I'm just like, man, I'm tired. I want to stop doing this. It's not really that fun. Whereas if I get together with my friends and play music, then that's super fun. And I think that will come through in the art. I hope. But I don't know. I'm sure at the same time, I'm sure that some people are going to make great stuff with AI music generators. And it's going to go a lot farther than it has. I don't know. So we'll see what happens.
When you're making the art, are you using Midjourney?
I go back and forth. Yeah, I have used Midjourney quite a bit, although Midjourney in particular, like 95% of what I see in there looks so cliched and stereotyped that I would be embarrassed to show it to anyone and claim it as my own. But just like with anything, like if you do crazy things with it, you can. What I like about Midjourney is putting in an image and then making variations of that image or shaping it. I find that to be quite interesting, actually. And Midjourney seems to be the best at doing that. I have also used there's a video engine called Runway, and it has a lot of image processing things too that are kind of interesting, but it's not really as good as Midjourney. Actually my favorite one was Dolly 2, which is what I used to make this image, but because it was less advanced, so it was, in my opinion, better at making kind of abstract things. When they released Dolly 3, it's terrible because it's only good for making like commercial logos and stuff like that. It's really good for that, but for making more arty things, I don't like it. So I stopped using it.
I know you've got a family obligation coming up. Can I rapid fire a couple questions here at you before we wrap up?
Go ahead.
Okay. Native instruments. How did you end up with them?
Oh, well, I was trying to figure out how to pay my rent in Los Angeles. And I ended up working in music technology. So at first I worked for M Audio for a little while, and I was like the Ableton expert. But that was only for about a year, and then I moved to Native Instruments. For how long did I work there? Like 6 years. Native Instruments is a very interesting company, especially then. They were like the cutting edge of software synthesis. I don't know if they still are really, but yeah, that was an interesting time. I was the support manager for North America, so I would try to listen to what our American customers said and try to relay that to the design team in Berlin, often unsuccessfully. I have to say, but on the other hand, I still use a lot of Native Instruments stuff myself. I've always used mostly Native Instruments because A, I have it, and B, it's good. So
yeah, like Kontakt, the guitar rig that they have, those are awesome.
Yeah, I use all those still today. I use Battery and Kontakt and Guitar Rig and Massive X. I actually wrote the manual for Massive, the first one. That was one of my jobs. You look in the front page. But lately, I've mostly been playing the bass guitar and the Chapman stick. Those are my instruments. And I've been making music with another electronic producer who now is doing all the beats. And I kind of just playing guitar licks now at the moment. But I'm using a lot of software to experiment with the guitar sounds. There's a lot you can do.
Okay. Next question I got for you, and if we run out of time here, I'd love to do a part 2 with you because we didn't quite touch on everything. But
We could probably
Wally,
do that. Oh, Wally, yeah. While I was working at Native Instruments, I kind of had a side hustle where I was doing sort of computer tech work for film composers. And most film composers use Apple Logic and Kontakt, and then they use all the sound libraries in Kontakt. And so they would have quite complex setups, and sometimes, so I would go out to somebody's house and help them with that. So through that, I got to know a number of people, and I got to know kind of a circle of musicians in LA, and those guys played with composer Thomas Newman a lot, and so he got me on the Wally gig. And yeah, Thomas Newman, the composer, if you're not familiar with him, he's written the soundtrack for literally countless major motion pictures in the last 30 years. And the way he works, he writes the orchestral parts and a lot of the score in his home studio using Kontakt. And then, I mean, most composers do that, but he will then come to the studio, and now they do it all remote, I think. But when we did Wally, we were still doing it in the studio. He had like the film cut and the score that he made, and he would play these different scenes, and then he had this crew of like half a dozen guys that he works with, and then he would be like, okay, this scene, I have this score that swells in like this, and we need some kind of dive bombing guitar sound. George, the guitar player, George, can you give me that? Well, George has played in like 5,000 movies, so George can give him that in like 1 second, and so then that's how Thomas Newman works, and he goes around. 2 of the guys that work with Thomas Newman are electronic sound designer guys who are both friends of mine, actually. And so they got me on that gig, and I did some electronic effects. But I wish I could have had that gig for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, my 2 friends already have that gig. So during the 3 days that we were in the studio working on Wally, I figured out that Thomas Newman didn't really need a 3rd sound designer as part of his crew. So I feel like I did a good job on that, but I didn't do such an amazing job that he was going to hire me over his long-term friends. I guess what I observed from that also, what I've seen in Hollywood is the best way to be successful is to start working with a famous director before they get famous.
mm,
But because the people that really have some, I don't know, this is just what I see, the people that have creative freedom are the people who like, I was your friend before, so I'm just going to let you do whatever because I know you're good. But once you're working on big budget projects and you're just hired on, then it's much more like, who can do this job that is going to deliver the result that we need or whatever. So, and that's probably Hans Zimmer in most cases, it seems. But yeah, I wish I could have done more of that, honestly. I don't know. I'm a little too slow also. You have to to do stuff like that, you have to be really quick because time is money. And I tend to spend many hours listening to things and tweaking them. Like, I don't know, a lot of producers are like me, but it helps if you want to work in Hollywood and studios, you'll be able to do it on the spot because they don't have time to waste. So
it seems like a good lesson to take away from a bunch of your stories is just meet a ton of people, travel a bunch, and things happen for you that way. But last but not
that's
least,
certainly
before
true.
yeah. Sorry to cut you off there, but last but not least, before I let you go, I'm a huge fan of hip hop music and production. So Dr. Dre, I understand you have had some interaction with his team. What was that like?
That was fun. I didn't actually get to meet Dr. Dre, unfortunately, but yeah, I was doing some work now and then for Native Instruments where I would go do like celebrity software training for people that were endorsing us usually. And so I worked with Weasel Zappa and Steve Vai and Dr. Dre's team and Herbie Hancock one time. And that was fun, obviously, to go meet some of these people. That was a job that I wanted to do. Eventually, they got a dedicated person to do that, so I didn't do it anymore. But I did go to his studio. That's in Sherman Oaks, California, and I demoed our new products for his team and showed him. It was really interesting seeing how they worked, actually, because it was quite different than anything I was used to. So they had like do you know what an MPC sampler is?
Yeah.
So for those who are listening that don't know, it's the old school sampler that has like the drum pads on the top, and it has the samples inside, so you don't need a computer to use it. So that's what a lot of classic hip hop has been made with. They would cut the samples into there and then play them on the pads or the drums or whatever. And so their studio was set up so that they explained to me how they would do sessions. They had room for like 3 or 4 people in there maybe doing it, and they would all sync them together, and they would have their little stations, and then they would try things together and kind of experiment and jam. And then when Dr. Dre was in there producing, he would be kind of, listening and being like, no, more of this. No, you stop doing that. That's kind of how they described it to me anyway. And they also had gigantic bass speakers in that studio that were like these bins that were for live concerts, they told me. So we didn't crank that up while I was there, but they said that the bass was pretty substantial, that they could crank out.
That's sweet. You got some awesome stories. Like I said, I'd love to have you back on to keep following up, but that's all I've got for you for now. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I think the audience will absolutely love it. So really, it's been a pleasure and very nice to meet you.
Okay, good talking to you, Thomas. It's been fun.
Yeah, for sure. So enjoy your evening. Thanks again. Very nice to meet you, John. And I'll follow up with you.
All right. Nice to meet you too. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye.